So now we're on step 5, right? So this time it's taken us a little while to get here. It took us 16 weeks to get it implemented, get things migrated, get the users back functioning, right? Very productive. Now we're on to finding a managed service provider, because big acronym, they can't do it just themselves,
Yeah,
right?
It's time for big acronym to taste the sauce.
Yeah, time to taste the sauce.
Yeah, it's sauce time.
Let's talk about managed service providers. So big acronym has a need here. Their need is IT services, compliance support, and security operations, or SOC services, right? They need all 3 of these to not only run a business effectively and functionally, but also to remain secure and stay compliant.
Yeah, and most of our portfolio of MSP clients are small businesses, exactly like big acronym.
Yep.
I mean, you see this all the time where they're like, we're only 50 people, we're only 20 people, we're 80 people.
Yep.
We got to have all 3 of these things, but we don't want to hire the people to make that happen.
Yep.
Right. That's most of Summit 7's MSP clients. And so, it's a joke that we're talking about big acronym, but this is such a real example that Daniel and I see all the time.
One of the interesting things that we talk about, especially with defense contractors, is it's actually usually more cost effective to go bill your IT person on a contract.
Right.
Right. And it's cheaper to actually use a managed service provider, assuming that they meet your requirements.
Sure.
All right, so let's talk about this. This is going to take about 6 weeks to vet, right? So this is the process that we're in, step 5. This is big acronym as we know it right now. They're in GCC high. Their users are productive. We're compliant. Now, let's bring in an MSP, right? Or an MSSP, right? That we might need to support the environment, and they do, right? Here are some of the questions that we have to ask. First one, do they have a shared responsibility matrix, or an SRM? Specifically to NIST 800-171A. A is an alpha. This is very important. And Joy's going to talk about this in more detail in step 6 and a little bit in step 7. Not only do they need to document the 110 controls with how they're supporting you, right? And identify that if they are, but they have to go all the way down to what we call in love, the assessment objective, right? So the assessment objectives are 320 questions that they need to be able to answer with roles and responsibilities on who's actually doing it, right? Is it the MSP's responsibility, or is it big acronym's responsibility? We're going to show you a snippet of that here in just a second.
And I'm going to quote Jacob Horn on this one and say, if you submitted your SPRS score based off of the 110 controls and not the 320 assessment objectives, you might be wrong.
Might be wrong. Yep.
Joy, you're going to talk about that in a little bit, right?
I sure am.
Awesome. So are they pursuing a CMMC level 2 certification, right? Is the MSP that's going to be supporting you also going to be certified to the same level? And honestly, they're going to need to be, right? At a minimum requirement from what we're seeing in the CAP, they're going to need to be CMMC level 2, if not even a higher level, which Joy can talk about here as well in just a little while. But it's very important to understand, are they going to pursue it? Can they support you during an assessment, right? Are they going to be able to provide the staff to speak on what the managed service is doing for you? Also very important to ask on the front end, because if they can't, you're already going to be at a disadvantage. Next up, do they have DIB customers? This sounds like a crazy question to ask, but if you're their only defense customer, right? Defense industrial base is what DIB stands for. There's probably a problem there. They probably don't have the infrastructure to support you that's compliant. They probably don't have the staff that is knowledgeable about the compliance requirements. And they might be learning, and that's great, right? We want businesses to grow throughout this process, and we need valuable and valid MSPs to do this. But it's really good to ask and vet, do they have any other customers they have to do this for? Have they assessed their own tools and different providers that they use for compliance? So, we talked about all the cloud requirements, right? A lot of MSPs use cloud services, right? One of the most common one is an offsite backup tool, right? It's very important to have that data protected in case of a disaster.
But I thought backup wasn't required.
Oh, yeah. There's this wonderful thing called business continuity that a lot of business owners, they tend to like, right? Sure. Keep the business going. But we want to make sure that those cloud providers that the MSP is using are also compliant. They got to meet the same requirements if we're talking about moving CUI or storing CUI into that place. Last up, do they have US persons, right? Big acronym has export control requirements. We don't want administrators of this environment that the MSP has to be non-US people that could have access to export control data, right? Jail, I don't think our big acronym Presidente wants to go to jail,
no,
right? So
Blazer would not make it.
Blazer would not make it to jail.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure we're very careful about that one.
I think, Daniel, also this is important to point out. A lot of managed service providers are trying to be cost effective to the small organizations, such as big acronym. And one of the ways that they do that is they outsource what is called NOC services or
Okay.
network operation centers. So the folks actually patching the devices and making sure that the event logs are managed and things to that nature that are fairly repetitive. A lot of MSPs are going to be outsourcing that to countries like India. So it's an important question that you're asking if you have ITAR and you're going to be in CMMC level 2 or level 3 yourself.
That is a great question. So what outsourced services is your outsourced MSP using?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because again, we don't want to jeopardize that, right? We don't want to have that risk on big acronym just because the question wasn't asked. Make sure to ask the questions.
Great point.
All right. So here's an example of an SRM, right? And this one's a little bit kind of more marketing focused, if you will,
Sure.
right? So we actually have a very detailed one all the way down to roles and responsibilities that our MSP uses for our clients, right? So we have quite a few customers in our MSP, and they're all DIB customers, right? It's the only industry that we support here at Summit 7 is the defense industrial base, all with the same requirements, which makes things a lot easier.
Yeah. And this is a screenshot of an actual deliverable that we hand over to our MSP customers.
Yep.
Documentation.
Yep. So we give documentation. It's very clear who's responsible, right? Is it the
Sure.
customer? Is it us? And we, again, have a more detailed version that we give them to make sure that they can pass an assessment, which I believe we recently had one pass at least a DIBCAC assessment. So that's very promising, right? We actually have people on staff that have walked our customers through it.
Yep.
All right. As we mentioned before, make sure that your MSPs are vetting their cloud providers, right? Ask them what cloud providers they're using. Ask them if they're storing, transmitting, or processing CUI on your behalf. Very important to ask. And all the way down back to what Joy was saying, we want to make sure that if there's export control data, example being backed up in a cloud that isn't compliant, that's going to be a problem, right?